Okay, we're going to start now. As I said, we've got people who've logged in from around the world, so we need to be fairly strict about time and timing. And our first speaker, I was almost going to say needs no introduction, because in my world, Professor Julia Davidson, OBE, is one of the leading academics in this field, been active in it almost for as long as I have, I think. And she's done
a long time, almost.
done pioneering work in particularly around online child sex abuse and some of the really horrible things that can happen to children when they go online. So Julia, over to you.
Thanks, John, and I hope everybody can see the slides. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. It's always a bit disconcerting when you're presenting behind a screen and all I can see is my PowerPoint. So, but anyway, it's great to be here. And what I want to do today, so Joe and I are a double act today, and we're going to be presenting some of our work from a recent study that we undertook for the NSPCC. Just really an update on child online risks and harms. But I'm going to start by setting the scene and talking about some of the context of this, particularly in relation to the evidence around this. So just to say something about our institute. So we're based at the University of East London. We're a small group of academics working across a range of areas that include cyber psychology, criminology, law and public health, working extensively on issues to do with online safety, child online protection, cybercrime and other health issues. But in terms of our work in this space, we've worked for many, many years, as John said, around child online harms, child abuse, serious offending. I think the first landmark study that we undertook was in 2012 when we did the European Online Grooming Project. And I think then back in 2012, we were just really recognising the scale of the problem in terms of children's exposure to online grooming. And then since then, a whole range of studies at European level. We've worked in the Middle East and most recently in Africa as well. We worked on child online protection in Rwanda with Five Rights, Beeb Kidron, and we've worked extensively with Ofcom as well, and DCMS, and now DSIT in the context of providing evidence or evidence in the effectiveness of the Online Safety Act. So just to sketch out the context, and I wanted to say something about the UK Council for Internet Safety, and I've chaired the evidence group for 6 or 7 years, and I'm sure that most of you know about UKIS and UKIS. We're not sure what the status of UKIS will be moving forward, but in the past it was a forum comprised of stakeholders from many different areas, government, academia, industry, who work together on online harms, chaired by ministers from the key government departments at the time. And the evidence group was charged with providing some of the evidence, not all of the evidence because we're a small group, some of the evidence that underpinned the Act in its very early stages. And in fact, we started working on the Act in 2017. So it was a long time coming. But in terms of the development of evidence, so just to sketch this out a bit, so you understand the way in which the evidence has underpinned some of the decision making around the Act. So in 2017, the evidence group was asked by DCMS to undertake a review of child online harms. And I did that with Joe and Sonia Livingston, our colleague, Sonia Livingston from the LSE. And then in 2019, we undertook a review of adult online harms. And I think these reports are still available on DCMS website if people want to go back and take a look at them. And then moving forward, we've done some work with Ofcom, trying to unpick some of the issues around the relationship between risk and harm and how we might categorize harm. And I think that's still a challenge. I think that still remains a challenge in the context of developing, exploring the effectiveness of the Online Safety Act as we move forward. And then in 2020, we undertook a review for DCMS of the developing safety tech sector, which would be of interest, I'm sure, to this audience. And in fact, there have been other reviews since, and we know that sector continues to grow in the UK, in the US, and in the EU. So I just really want to, before we move on to the NSPCC report, I wanted to reflect on some of the findings from our original research and just think about what it tells us about young people, about children and young people's use of technology. And we know this, but I think, you know, it's nice, particularly as I have a reputation, I think, for focusing on harms and on perhaps negative aspects. It is nice to think about the benefits as well. And of course, there are benefits for young people, and we know what they are. We developed for Ofcom a framework of benefits that focus on knowledge, connection, enjoyment, and expression, and develop lots of categories, as you can see, across those benefits. And I think it's important to perhaps start on a positive before we think about some of the more difficult aspects faced by children and young people. So Ofcom asked us to develop a framework of risk and harm for them in the context of guidance they were developing at the time for VSBs. And we started to think about different categories of harm and the relationship between risk and harm. And I think we don't fully understand in research terms what the relationship between risk and harm is, because what we do know is that risk does not always equal harm. And risk and harm is contingent upon a number of issues. So, you know, the harm experienced by a child might be a very individual thing. So it might have to do, for example, with the age of the child, the stage of cognitive development. It might have to do with the vulnerability of the child. And I think it really helps us in the context of looking at the effectiveness of the legislation in future to try and better understand the relationship between risk and harm across some of these additional variables. And so, for example, we've identified the harms and tried to categorize them, the potential harms. So clearly, sexual harms, harms that could be categorized broadly as aggression. So, you know, hate speech, violence, extreme content, harms that could be described as manipulation. And of course, you know, these can be cross-cutting across the different categories. And self-injurious harms as well. So exposure to self-harm, eating disorders, etc. And then we try to think about, well, you know, what are the kind of potential, what is the potential harm, what's the potential impact upon children and young people across a number of areas. And looking at mental health and well-being, so you know, psychological distress, depression, anxiety, a whole range of factors. What is the impact on cognitive ability and cognitive function? And I think whilst we understand that in the context, well, perhaps we have some information, some research evidence on that in the context of adolescents and older children, we certainly don't have research information at the moment about the impact of digital and screen time on very young children and toddlers. So I think that's a real gap in our research. So, you know, what is the impact on morality as well in terms of children's ability to make judgments around key areas, decision making? So in the context, therefore, if you think about exposure to pornography, how does that impact children's understanding of adult sexual relationships? So lots of work to be done, and I think we don't really fully understand the relationship between risk and harm yet. I want to move on to talk about NSPCC work. I'm just really going to outline the context of this and talk about some of the key recommendations, and then Joe is going to run through some of the findings. So Joe was the lead for this work. So it was a non-exhaustive literature review and really a follow-up. So you remember the diagram I put up at the beginning, which set out the timeline around the evidence base. And this is really the next step. So a kind of follow-on, if you like, to the 2017 study that Joe and I conducted with Sonia on behalf of the UK's Evidence Group. And the questions here were, what are the new developments in the risk landscape? What does the current evidence suggest about children's exposure to online sexual risks? What does the current evidence suggest about children's exposure to other types of online risk and associated harm? So really coming back to that, the framework that I showed before. What does the current evidence suggest about the ways in which technological design features moderate the likelihood of children encountering or being harmed by online risks? And what are the gaps in current understanding? And I think I highlighted one of those gaps before. So certainly for me, the big gap, I think, for us in our understanding is around very young children and the impact of their exposure. So the review, what's the status? What's the importance of the review? Is it just another review? Well, as I said, it builds upon the 2017 UKIS review. And I think it's important. I think it's a landmark piece because it really makes clear how the absence of regulation before the implementation of the Act left children exposed to online risks that were often, in our view, avoidable. And, you know, when we reflect upon the amount of time it took to introduce the legislation, I think that's something we have to live with. This review establishes a baseline for the risk landscape, so it's a new baseline from which to build as the Act has passed into law. I do think if some of the recommendations, so we've made a series of recommendations around research and research base in future, and the NSPCC have made a series of recommendations as well. Do have a look at the report. But I think, you know, this will enable an assessment of changes linked to the introduction of the new regulatory regime, which in my view should be independent. So it's our view that the OSA should be reviewed on a rolling basis and the effectiveness of the implementation evaluated and certainly evaluated independently. So what changes? What's changed? Well, I probably don't need to tell this audience, but I think it's worth just re-emphasising what we know has changed. Smartphone ownership and social media use amongst children has continued to rise. We know that to be true. A huge rise in online child sexual exploitation and abuse during the pandemic, an exponential rise, a tsunami of child abuse images, images depicting ever younger children. Social media, the migration of children from older platforms to newer platforms such as TikTok. Immersive online social and gaming spaces. As somebody mentioned before, I just caught the end of the last session, and someone mentioned before the risk of VR, for example, and AI. We're just conducting some research on child safety in the metaverse with some not unsurprising findings. So I think that's a big concern as well at the moment. We know that there's now a duty of care that's been placed upon industry. Ofcom is the regulator. The development of the new safety tech sector, which I mentioned before. Increasing debate regarding online hate and misogyny. Introduction of new offences such as cyber flashing. I just wanted to re-emphasise what I said before, because I think this is really important when we try to evaluate the effectiveness of the legislation moving forward. that risk does not always equal harm. That isn't to say that we shouldn't mitigate against risk, but I think what we do need to better understand is which children are at, greater risk from exposure to particular types of harm. And as I said, a number of factors may influence the relationship between risk and harm, including age, vulnerability, the type of risk, the length of exposure to risk, and also protective factors, other protective factors around the child. I just wanted to focus on some of the recommendations from the report and focusing on the industry recommendations. It's a long report and lots of recommendations for different stakeholder groups. But in terms of industry responsibility, I think one of the key messages is that, and we know this, is that companies need to take the initiative to significantly reduce the levels of harm on their platforms and should not wait for Ofcom to use their regulatory powers to force them to do so. So taking proactive steps to prevent harm through safer design, so building robust safety features, applying age assurance technologies, designing age-appropriate content and spaces, and monitoring is regular monitoring is absolutely key. Committing resource to research and development of solutions as well that can mitigate risks, providing the necessary degree of human moderation to check automated decisions. So we can't just rely on, on AI decision making. We really need to have some degree of human moderation to check automated decision making. Training and care for moderators as well is really important. So fully trained and supported to perform their work effectively, because we know from other research that this kind of work can have a really negative impact on moderators, so they have to be supported in their work. Proactively detecting illicit behaviour and content and taking swift remedial action to permanently remove associated content, accounts and users. So we believe that platforms choose a victim-centred approach, which is a bit of shift, will involve a bit of shift in thinking in their reporting and complaints mechanisms. Should make it possible for children to make a report retrospectively if they cannot relay their concerns in real time or immediately after their encounter. Because what we know from our research is that often children are very upset, immediately very upset, but then feel afterwards that they would like to make a report when they've reflected on what's happened to them. Children should be offered appropriate options to describe their experience and be reassured that their report will be taken seriously and their confidentiality maintained. Ensuring reporting methods are child-friendly and easy for children to locate and to use if they wish to make a report or complaint or flag harmful behaviour. Now, we know this isn't true of some of the platforms at the moment, many of the platforms, and it certainly isn't true in the context of the research into the metaverse that we've been conducting. So this is absolutely a priority. So in the context of research, the evidence base is so important. If we don't have a good baseline, we can't move forward. It's very difficult to measure effectiveness in the context of the legislation as well. So there's a need for a more substantial prevalence, experience and impact research database that should be built centrally at government level. This area of research is woefully underfunded. I can get funding for financially motivated cybercrime in an instant to do that kind of research. But you try to get funding to do this type of work, it's really very difficult. Research should be independent of industry. We need development of robust measures and data sets to underpin the Online Safety Act, and data should be collected using a systematic and longitudinal methodology, so that, much like the kind of standard surveys like the census so that we have that data and it becomes a resource that we can all have access to and can draw on in the context of developing good practice. So just very quickly, implications for future research. So more research is needed that specifically looks at types of engagement or pathways to risk and harm. So how do children become involved? How do they become harmed? Which type of children are more likely to become harmed than others or to experience harm? Which children are most at risk? And how can we design services and support that responds to their needs? Studies are needed that go beyond descriptive statistics. We need some qualitative work as well to try and understand the nuance of children's experience. The Global South, I wanted to mention the Global South because really so much of our research is funded by the Global North and is based in the Global North. It's really very, very, very difficult to get funding to conduct work in the Global South with partners, and the need is huge, absolutely huge. We work extensively with partners in Africa. So difficult to get funding to introduce some basic work, child online protection work in the Global South. I said before that I feel that a huge gap that's really overlooked is the impact of digital upon very young children. Very difficult to research, but there are some researchers working in this area, very underfunded. And I think finally, what are the implications for children of immersive tech in the context of risk and harm? This is really an area where we need to focus our attention as we move forward. And that's my email address if you want to contact me. And I think it's probably over to Joe next for the findings from the work.
Do you want to should we go straight through with Joe now, and we take questions to both of you at the end, yeah? Is that how you want to do it?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, as Joe is doing the second bit, yeah.
Okay, I've just got to log out of being in the audience.